The morning fog rolled across London as Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stepped off the military transport at RAF Northolt. His dress blue uniform was packed carefully in a garment bag, every crease pressed to perfection back at Camp Pendleton. At 29 years old, Thompson carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from serving in some of the world's most dangerous places. His chest bore ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan, including the Purple Heart he had earned when an IED blast nearly took his life in Helmand Province. Thompson had been handpicked for this assignment by his commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, who had specifically requested someone with both combat experience and an spotless record in ceremonial duties. The mission seemed straightforward enough: represent the United States Marine Corps during a joint ceremony with British forces at Windsor Castle. What Thompson didn't know was that this day would test everything he had learned about military bearing, diplomacy, and the unspoken language that exists between warriors. The drive from the airfield to Windsor took 40 minutes through the English countryside. Thompson stared out the window at the rolling green hills, so different from the desert landscapes where he had spent much of the past decade. His mind wandered to his father, also a Marine, who had told him stories about working with British forces during the Falklands conflict. "They're good soldiers," his father had said. "Proud people with a long history. Show them the same respect you'd want them to show you." At Windsor Castle, Thompson was escorted through ancient corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens. The weight of history seemed to press down on him from every direction. These walls had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, state functions, and military traditions. Now he would be part of that history, representing not just himself, but the entire Marine Corps before an international audience. The protocol officer, a crisp British Army captain named Sarah Bennett, briefed Thompson on the day's schedule. "The ceremony begins at 1400 hours, she explained in her precise accent. "You'll be positioned on the south side of the courtyard, representing American forces. The Queen's Guard will take position opposite you. Media will be present, as will several hundred invited guests and tourists." Thompson nodded, absorbing every detail. He had participated in dozens of ceremonies at Marine Corps bases and military installations. But this felt different. The stakes seemed higher somehow, the expectations greater. He thought about the millions of people who would eventually see photos and video footage of this event, judging not just him but the entire Marine Corps based on his performance. In his assigned preparation room, Thompson carefully donned his dress blue uniform. Each element was checked and double-checked. The gold buttons polished to mirror brightness, the red trim perfectly aligned, his ribbons arranged in exact regulation order. His white dress gloves were spotless. His black leather shoes reflected the room's lighting like black mirrors. The traditional Marine Corps sword hung at his side, its blade sharp enough to shave with, though it would never be drawn during the ceremony. As Thompson made final adjustments to his uniform, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a working-class neighborhood in Detroit to the halls of one of Britain's most famous castles seemed impossible, yet here he was. His mother, who had worked 2 jobs to keep him in school, would be watching the ceremony on television back home. She had always been proud of his service, but this felt like something special even to her. The walk to the courtyard took Thompson through more historic corridors, past suits of armor that had protected medieval knights and paintings depicting famous battles from centuries past. British castle staff moved efficiently around him, preparing for the ceremony with the practiced precision of people who managed such events regularly. Thompson could hear the growing murmur of crowds gathering outside, the clicking of camera equipment being set up, the distant sound of military units preparing. When Thompson first stepped into the courtyard, he was struck by its grandeur. The ancient stone walls rose majestically around him, topped with flags that snapped in the afternoon breeze. Hundreds of spectators were already gathering behind rope barriers, many holding cameras and phones. Television crews from multiple networks had positioned their equipment for the best views. This was clearly going to be a much larger event than Thompson had initially understood. Thompson took his assigned position and immediately began his mental preparation routine. Years of military training had taught him how to enter the focused state required for ceremonial duties. He controlled his breathing, straightened his already perfect posture, and allowed his mind to settle into the calm alertness that would be required for the next several hours. Around him, the crowd continued to grow, but Thompson tuned out the distractions. A group of American veterans, visiting London as part of a tour group, recognized Thompson's uniform and began pointing him out to their companions. One elderly man, wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, stood a little straighter when he saw the young Marine. "Look at that bearing," he whispered to his wife. "That's what a real Marine looks like." British military personnel moved through the courtyard making final preparations. Thompson could see them checking positions, testing communication equipment, and coordinating with civilian security. Everything had to be perfect for an event of this magnitude, and Thompson appreciated the professionalism he observed in their preparations. These were serious soldiers who took their duties as seriously as he took his own. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting dramatic shadows across the courtyard's ancient stones. Thompson felt sweat forming under his uniform but ignored the discomfort. Physical discomfort was irrelevant when duty called. He had stood guard in 120-degree heat in Iraq and -20 cold in Afghanistan. A pleasant English afternoon posed no challenge at all. As the ceremony's start time approached, Thompson could feel the anticipation building in the crowd. Conversations became quieter, cameras were readied, and an air of expectation settled over the courtyard. Thompson had experienced this feeling many times before major events. The moment when preparation gives way to performance, when training becomes reality, when everything learned in practice must be executed flawlessly before critical eyes. Thompson's commanding officer had given him specific instructions before departing Camp Pendleton. "Remember that you're not just representing yourself out there, Staff Sergeant. You're representing every Marine who ever wore the uniform. Make us proud." Now, standing in this historic courtyard with hundreds of people watching and cameras rolling, Thompson felt the full weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden he was honored to carry. The sound that announced the arrival of the Queen's Guard was unlike anything most tourists had ever heard. The synchronized footsteps of professional probably, soldiers moving in perfect unison across ancient cobblestones. Leading this formation was Guardsman Christopher Hayes, whose family had served the British Crown for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had fought at the Somme, his grandfather at Normandy, and his father in Northern Ireland. Now it was Christopher's turn to uphold the family tradition. At 32, Hayes was considered a veteran among the Queen's Guard. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Welsh Guards before transferring to ceremonial duties at Windsor Castle. His red tunic was immaculate, each gold button catching the afternoon light like a tiny mirror. The famous bearskin hat, standing 18 inches tall and weighing nearly 2 pounds, sat on his head with the authority that came from years of wearing it during the longest and most demanding ceremonies. Hayes had been specifically chosen for this duty because of his experience working with American forces during joint operations in Helmand Province. His commanding officer, Major David Richardson, had personally selected him for this assignment. "You understand, Americans," Hayes, the major had said. "You've served alongside them. You know they're good soldiers. I need someone who can represent the regiment properly, while showing appropriate respect for our allies." As Hayes marched into position, his trained eyes took in every detail of the scene before him. The crowd was larger than usual for a weekday ceremony, clearly drawn by the unusual nature of this joint American-British event. Television crews from both countries had positioned themselves for optimal coverage. This would be broadcast internationally, making it one of the most visible ceremonies he had ever participated in. The distance between Hayes and the American Marine was approximately 20 feet, close enough to be clearly visible to each other, far enough apart to represent their separate but allied nations. Hayes could immediately tell that the American was a professional soldier. The Marine's bearing was unmistakable. Spine straight, shoulders back, eyes focused straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare that Hayes recognized from his own service in combat zones. Hayes assumed his position with the fluid precision that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training on the parade ground at Wellington Barracks. His rifle, an SA-80 ceremonial version, was held at precisely the regulation angle. His feet were positioned exactly shoulder-width apart, his breathing controlled and steady. Every aspect of his posture spoke of centuries of British military tradition, of guards who had protected monarchs through wars, revolutions, and the changing face of history itself. The crowd seemed to sense immediately that something special was happening. Tour guides stopped their standard presentations to point out the unusual pairing of British and American soldiers. Children who had been running around the courtyard grew quiet, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something important. Even experienced travelers who had seen many military ceremonies recognized that this was different, that there was an electricity in the air that went beyond normal tourist attractions. Hayes was acutely aware of the American Marine's presence without looking directly at him. Years of military training had taught him to be conscious of everything in his peripheral vision, while maintaining perfect ceremonial bearing. He could tell from the Marine's posture and the way he held himself that this was someone who took his duties seriously, someone who understood the weight of representing his service and country before an international audience. The protocol officer moved between the two soldiers, making final adjustments and ensuring that both men were positioned correctly for the cameras and official observers. British and American flags hung motionless in the still air, their colors bright against the gray stone of the castle walls. The scene looked like something from a movie, almost too perfect to be real. Yet it was very real and very important to the hundreds of people who had gathered to witness it. A BBC correspondent began filming her introduction, standing where she could capture both soldiers in the background. "What we're seeing here at Windsor Castle today is truly unique," she said into her microphone. "A British guardsman and an American Marine, representing the special relationship between our two nations, standing together in one of the most historic settings in the United Kingdom." Hayes felt the familiar calm that came over him during important ceremonies. His mind was clear, his body perfectly balanced, his breathing steady and controlled. This was what he had trained for, what his family traditions had prepared him for. He was a living link in a chain that stretched back hundreds of years. And he would not be the one to weaken that chain. The Marine across from him maintained equally perfect bearing. Hayes could appreciate the professionalism on display, recognizing in the American the same dedication to excellence that marked the best British soldiers. There was something in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared values and mutual respect that transcended nationality and uniform differences. Dr. Margaret Foster, a military historian from Oxford University, who happened to be among the spectators, later wrote in her journal, "What struck me immediately was the obvious mutual respect between these two professional soldiers. Even without speaking or making eye contact, there was clearly a connection based on their shared commitment to military excellence." The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard. Both soldiers adjusted automatically to the changing light conditions without compromising their positions. These were warriors who had learned to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental standards. Combat experience had taught them that situations evolve, but principles remain constant. A group of American students, visiting London on a school trip, gathered near the rope barriers to get a better view. Their teacher, a former Army officer herself, quietly explained to them what they were witnessing. "Those two men represent the best of their respective services," she said. "They've trained for years to be able to stand like that, to represent their countries with that kind of dignity and professionalism." Hayes could hear the murmur of conversations in the crowd, the clicking of camera shutters, the occasional direction from television crews adjusting their equipment. But these sounds seemed to fade into the background as his focus narrowed to the ceremony itself and his role in representing centuries of British military tradition. He was no longer Christopher Hayes the individual. He had become a symbol of everything the Queen's Guard stood for. The protocol officer made one final check of both positions, ensuring that everything was ready for the arrival of the official party. British and American military attachés conferred quietly about the schedule, making certain that every detail had been considered. This ceremony would be remembered and analyzed, photographed, and broadcast around the world. There was no room for error, no opportunity for second chances. As the formal ceremony prepared to begin, both Hayes and Thompson stood ready. They represented different nations, different military traditions, different histories, but they also represented something universal: the dedication of professional soldiers who put service above self, duty above comfort, and honor above personal recognition. The stage was set for something remarkable to unfold. The moment that would be remembered and talked about for years to come began with something so subtle that most observers almost missed it entirely. A sudden gust of wind swept across the courtyard, threatening to disturb the perfect positioning of Hayes's towering bearskin hat. Without breaking his rigid stance, or moving his head even slightly, the British guardsman made the most minute adjustment possible, a barely perceptible shift that maintained the hat's regulation position, while demonstrating the kind of professional skill that comes only from years of ceremonial experience. Thompson caught the movement immediately. Despite standing 20 feet away and maintaining his own perfect position of attention, his peripheral vision and combat-trained awareness picked up on Hayes's masterful handling of the situation. What happened next defied every protocol, manual, and ceremonial regulation, yet somehow felt completely natural and entirely appropriate for the moment. In response to Hayes's display of professional competence, Thompson executed what could barely be called a nod, a movement so small it lasted perhaps half a second and involved nothing more than the slightest inclination of his head. To untrained observers, it might have appeared to be nothing more than a natural adjustment. But to Hayes, and to the military personnel watching in the crowd, it was unmistakably deliberate. Thompson was acknowledging Hayes's skill with the quiet respect of one professional warrior recognizing another. The crowd didn't immediately understand what they had witnessed. The exchange was so subtle, so professional, so perfectly controlled, that many people missed it entirely. But those who caught it, particularly the veterans scattered throughout the audience, recognized something extraordinary. Here were two soldiers from different continents, bound by different oaths, wearing different uniforms, but clearly united by the same fundamental commitment to military excellence and mutual respect. Hayes's response came without hesitation and with the same incredible subtlety. Without moving his head, shifting his feet, or compromising his ceremonial position in any way, he executed a movement so small it could barely be detected. A slight straightening of his already perfect posture that somehow managed to convey acknowledgement and respect. To civilian observers, it would have been completely invisible. To Thompson, it was as clear and meaningful as a formal salute between brothers in arms. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, something remarkable happened that transcended military protocol and international boundaries. Two professional soldiers had acknowledged each other across the gap that separated their positions, recognizing in each other the dedication, sacrifice, and commitment to excellence that marked them as members of an elite brotherhood that exists beyond politics, geography, and uniform distinctions. Captain James Morrison, a retired British Army officer who was visiting Windsor Castle with his family, was one of the few civilians who fully understood what he had just witnessed. "My God," he whispered to his wife. "Did you see that? Those two just communicated more effectively than most people do with 1,000 words. That's what real military professionalism looks like." Unquote. A photographer from Reuters, positioned at exactly the right angle with the perfect lens, captured the moment in a series of photographs that would later appear in military publications around the world. The images showed two soldiers in different uniforms representing different nations. But the subtle body language between them told a story of connection and mutual respect that needed no caption to explain. The crowd began to sense that something significant had happened, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. Conversations grew quieter as people focused their attention on the two motionless figures who seemed to be communicating through discipline and bearing alone. Tour guides paused their standard presentations, recognizing that they were witnessing something that couldn't be scripted or planned. Dr. Emily Watson, a psychologist specializing in nonverbal communication, who happened to be among the spectators, later described the moment in an academic paper. "What I observed was a perfect example of how highly trained professionals can communicate complex messages through the most minimal physical cues. The mutual respect and recognition displayed by these two soldiers was more eloquent than any formal diplomatic exchange." The moment was broken by the arrival of the official party, British and American military leaders who had come for the formal ceremony. But the effect of what had just happened lingered in the air like an electric charge. As dignitaries took their positions and protocol officers made final preparations, both Thompson and Hayes resumed their full ceremonial roles without any change in their perfect military bearing. Throughout the formal proceedings that followed, neither man showed any deviation from the highest standards of military discipline. They performed their ceremonial duties flawlessly, each representing his service and nation with unwavering professionalism. But for those who had witnessed the subtle exchange, the formal ceremony seemed almost secondary to the moment of genuine connection that had already taken place. The official proceedings included speeches about the historic alliance between Britain and America, presentations of ceremonial gifts, and the formal exchange of military honors. British and American flags were presented, national anthems were played, and diplomatic pleasantries were exchanged between the visiting officials. But many in the crowd found their attention drawn repeatedly back to the two soldiers who continued to stand at their posts with unchanging discipline. Word of the exchange began to spread through the crowd in whispers and pointed observations. Those who had witnessed it described it to those who had missed it, trying to convey the significance of something so subtle yet so meaningful. The fact that the communication had been entirely nonverbal made it even more impressive to those who understood military protocol and the level of control required to maintain such perfect bearing while still acknowledging a fellow professional. A group of American military families, visiting London while their service member father was assigned to the embassy, gathered near the barriers to get a better view. The children asked their mother why everyone was so interested in the two soldiers who weren't moving. "Sometimes," she explained, "the most important conversations happen without any words at all. Those two men just showed respect for each other in a way that only soldiers really understand." Television crews, initially focused on capturing the formal ceremony, began to realize that they had witnessed something newsworthy in the interaction between Thompson and Hayes. Camera operators started focusing more attention on the two soldiers, though many struggled to understand exactly what made their presence so compelling. The story would become clearer only when they reviewed their footage later and could analyze the subtle moments that had created such a powerful impression on live observers. As the formal ceremony continued with its scheduled presentations and speeches, both Thompson and Hayes maintained their positions with unwavering discipline. They had become living symbols of military professionalism, representing not just their individual services but the broader values that unite professional soldiers regardless of nationality. The crowd watched them with increasing fascination, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and meaningful that went far beyond normal tourist attractions or routine military ceremonies. As the formal ceremony concluded and the official party began to disperse, neither Thompson nor Hayes moved from their positions. Their duties required them to maintain their posts until formally dismissed, regardless of what was happening around them. The crowd, which had initially begun to thin as tourists moved on to other attractions and officials departed for scheduled meetings, found themselves drawn back to observe these two professionals who continued to demonstrate unwavering discipline long after the cameras had stopped rolling. A core group of military veterans, recognizing something extraordinary in what they were witnessing, positioned themselves where they could continue observing both men. Among them was retired Command Sergeant Major Robert Sterling, who had served 38 years in the British Army and participated in countless ceremonial duties. Sterling had worked with American forces during multiple NATO exercises and understood better than most civilians what he was seeing unfold before his eyes. "Look at them both," Sterling murmured to his companion, another retired soldier. "Neither one will give an inch of ground. They understand what they represent, and they know people are watching. That's what genuine military bearing looks like when it's tested by time and attention." The media representatives were beginning to understand that they had documented something genuinely newsworthy, though many struggled to find adequate words to describe the wordless communication that had taken place. The Reuters photographer who had captured the earlier exchange continued shooting, documenting the sustained professionalism displayed by both soldiers. A CNN correspondent began making detailed notes, trying to capture the essence of the unspoken respect that had been demonstrated. Thompson remained absolutely motionless, but his mind was fully active. He thought about the Marine Corps values that had been hammered into him since his first day at Parris Island: honor, courage, and commitment. This extended duty was testing all three simultaneously. Honor demanded that he maintain his position and represent the Corps with distinction until properly dismissed. Courage was required to stand before hundreds of observers and international media without showing any sign of fatigue or discomfort. Commitment meant seeing this assignment through to its completion, regardless of physical strain or mental pressure. Hayes's thoughts followed similar patterns, though filtered through the centuries-old traditions of the British Army and the specific heritage of the Queen's Guard. The regimental motto, Nulli Secundus, second to none, echoed in his consciousness. His unit had served the crown for over 300 years, through wars and revolutions, always maintaining the highest possible standards of military bearing and professional conduct. He was a living representative of that unbroken tradition, and nothing would make him the soldier who failed to uphold it. The afternoon wind picked up strength, causing flags to snap more vigorously and creating additional challenges for maintaining perfect uniform appearance. Both men adjusted automatically for the changing weather conditions without compromising their fundamental positions or breaking their disciplined bearing. These were combat veterans who had learned to adapt to circumstances while maintaining their core standards and principles. A young British schoolgirl, perhaps 8 years old, tugged persistently at her teacher's sleeve. "Miss, why don't those soldiers move or talk to each other?" The teacher, who had served briefly in the territorial army before becoming an educator, knelt down to provide an age-appropriate explanation. "Those men are showing respect for their countries and their uniforms by standing perfectly still. They're demonstrating that they're professionals who take their duties very seriously." As the afternoon progressed and the crowd gradually thinned, the intensity of attention from those who remained actually increased rather than decreased. These were people who understood that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary tourist attractions, a demonstration of military professionalism that transcended cultural boundaries and national differences, while highlighting the shared values that unite professional soldiers worldwide. A local television news crew arrived after receiving reports of an unusual display of international military cooperation. The reporter struggled initially to convey the story's significance to viewers who hadn't witnessed the event firsthand. "What we're observing here isn't dramatic or action-packed in any conventional sense," she explained to her camera, "but it represents something profound about military service, professional respect, and international cooperation. These two soldiers have been maintaining their positions for over 3 hours now, demonstrating perfect discipline while showing mutual respect that requires no words to communicate or understand." The late afternoon sun began casting longer, more dramatic shadows across the ancient courtyard stones. Both Thompson and Hayes remained absolutely motionless, their uniform still perfect despite hours of standing at attention, their bearing unchanged from the moment they had first taken their positions. They had become living monuments to military excellence, physical representations of everything their respective services and nations stood for in terms of professionalism and dedication. Finally, as the day's official duties concluded, the protocol officer approached both soldiers to formally dismiss them from their extended posts. Even then, neither Thompson nor Hayes immediately moved. They maintained their positions for several additional seconds, as if reluctant to break the powerful connection that had developed during their shared vigil, and unwilling to end a moment that had taken on significance far beyond their original orders. When they finally did move, it was with the same precision, control, and professional bearing they had maintained throughout the entire afternoon. Thompson executed a perfect about-face and began marching toward his designated departure point with the fluid movements of a Marine who had spent years perfecting every aspect of military drill and ceremony. Hayes performed the elaborate, traditional movements required of the Queen's Guard when changing positions, each motion precise and controlled, despite the physical demands of hours spent in rigid attention. The remaining crowd burst into spontaneous applause, an unusual response to any military ceremony, but one that felt entirely appropriate given what the observers had experienced. They understood instinctively that they had witnessed something special and significant. They had seen two professional soldiers demonstrate the highest traditions of their respective services, while finding common ground in their shared commitment to duty, honor, and excellence that transcended all other differences. As Thompson and Hayes disappeared into their respective areas to prepare for departure, the crowd slowly began to disperse. But the conversations continued long after the courtyard emptied. People shared photographs and video recordings, trying to capture and preserve what they had experienced. The story began spreading immediately through social media platforms, military publications, and simple word of mouth, growing with each retelling while somehow maintaining the essential truth of what had actually taken place. The encounter between the Marine and the Royal Guard had lasted only a few hours, but it had created a moment of genuine human connection that would resonate far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. It served as powerful proof that some values, honor, duty, respect, and professionalism, are truly universal, transcending nationality, service branch, cultural background, and all other artificial divisions. It was a perfect reminder of what military service at its absolute best can represent. The dedication of individuals who put service above self and excellence above comfort, creating bonds of mutual respect and understanding that need no words to express, explain, or validate.